an unfinished work of literature, an archive of descriptive history. Your body and your genome can be read as a comprehensive dossier on a succession of colourful worlds long vanished, worlds that surrounded your ancestors long gone, a genetic book of the dead.
I'm calling it neo-Darwinism, but that word, as we'll see, means quite a complicated mixture of things. A wit once remarked that by the time The Origin of Species reached its 6th edition, Darwin's great book should have been retitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection and All Sorts of Other Things. It's a strange fact that in many ways the 1st edition is closer to our modern view of Darwinism than the 6th and last edition, which is presumably the one that Darwin himself regarded as definitive. And one of the most revealing differences is the famous last sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone circling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I don't often have opportunities or indeed desire for national pride, but I can't help calling attention to the Bank of England £10 note and the portrait on the right-hand side, and contrast it with that is the cue for the addition to the 2nd edition of The Origin of Species, which is what I was just about to talk about. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that, etc. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. And it is somewhat reminiscent of the In God We Trust that you see there, which was added, I forget the exact date, everybody else here will know, 1950-something. 54.
Was in the Pledge of Allegiance.
And the Pledge of Allegiance as well. Yeah. So there's a sort of parallel there. Darwin was, in a sense, pressured into adding by the Creator in that crucial place in the last sentence of his book. That was not his original intention in the 1st edition. Darwin, oh, by the way, I should say I'm very happy to take interruptions for if anybody doesn't understand anything. I'm happy to, because I've got another lecture tomorrow, so it doesn't matter if we overrun a bit. So if you want to interrupt with questions for clarification, please do. Not with sort of, your own personal statement or something, but anything you don't understand. And I think in some ways it actually livens it up if people want to interrupt. Charles Darwin explained the immense diversity of life, but even more important in my view, he explained adaptation. Adaptation is not a very good word. It sort of means modified for a functional reason. And it denotes the fact that living things look as though they've been designed. In the words of David Hume's Cleanthes, all these various machines and even their most minute parts are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. By this argument a posteriori, and by this argument alone, do we prove at once the existence of a deity and his similarity to human mind and intelligence. That's not Hume himself speaking, I hasten to add. That's his fictional character, Cleanthes. Now, in my opinion, natural selection is not only the correct explanation for the remarkable phenomenon of adaptation, it's also the only theory that has ever been suggested that can, in principle, explain adaptation. I don't have time to go into that, but I've written it up in The Blind Watchmaker. And by the way, I have here a Spanish edition of The Blind Watchmaker, which, as with the God Delusion, I would like to present to the naturalist guides on this tour, and will put in the library for that purpose. I don't know whether you also want for the library. I've got English editions of at least some of my books here, which I'll put in the library if the ship's company decide that they would like them. So I was saying that I think that Darwinian natural selection is the only theory that has ever been proposed which is in principle capable of explaining the phenomenon of adaptation. The only known rivals are design and the Lamarckian theory. Well, design clearly cannot be the ultimate explanation because it immediately begs the question of who designed the designer. Lamarck's theory, which Lobo told us about briefly yesterday, is at least in principle a better candidate, but I've given arguments in The Blind Watchmaker that Lamarck's theory cannot actually explain adaptation, not because the facts are wrong, which they are, because acquired characteristics are not inherited, but even if the facts were right, the theory would not be a big enough one to explain the extraordinary elegance of adaptation, which, as Hume's Cleanthes said, ravishes into admiration all who've ever contemplated them. It was another piece of partial backsliding by Darwin in later editions of The Origin to engage in a flirtation with the Lamarckian theory. He abandoned natural selection as a monopoly on the explanation as a driving force of evolution. And Darwin was led to this backsliding in part by a criticism of The Origin of Species in the Edinburgh Review by an engineer. Why is it always engineers, I wonder? Called Fleeming Jenkin. Fleeming Jenkin put his point in terms which were characteristic of the racism that was endemic in the Victorian era. He imagined a shipwrecked mariner who was white landing on an island which was peopled by black people. And he imagined that this white sailor would mate with all the women on the island, and that he would be so obviously superior that, quote, "In the first generation there will be some dozens of intelligent young mulattoes, much superior in average intelligence to the Negroes. We might expect the throne for some generations to be occupied by a more or less yellow king. But can anyone believe that the whole island will gradually acquire a white or even a yellow population, or that the islanders would acquire the energy, courage, ingenuity, patience, self-control, endurance, in virtue of which qualities our hero killed so many of their ancestors and begot so many children? These qualities, in fact, which the struggle for existence would select, if it could select anything." Well, if you separate out the racism, which today, to today's sensibility is so shocking, what Fleeming Jenkin was trying to say is that on the then current view of inheritance, which was blending inheritance, any qualities which might have been favored by natural selection would be swamped by blending inheritance. Blending inheritance was the prevailing genetic idea of the 19th century. It's rather than use Fleming Jenkins' racist terms, let's do it in terms of paint. You see on the right-hand side there, red paint added to blue paint makes purple paint. Intermediate. But if you then mix purple paint with purple paint, you never reconstitute red and blue. You only ever get purple again. In genetic terms, what that would mean is that the variation in the population would very rapidly disappear. The variance in statistical terms would be halved, divided in two in every generation. If we really were a blend of our mother and our father, like mixing pots of paint, which is what people thought it was. If it really was like people mixing pots of paint, then every generation would be more uniform, less variable than its predecessors. Our grandparents would all have been much more variable than we would. We'd all be looking pretty much alike because of this paint mixing effect. Now we know, of course, that the answer to that riddle, which gave Darwin so much trouble, was solved by Gregor Mendel. But it gave Darwin great grief in his time, because as far as Fleming Jenkins could see and as far as everybody else could see, this meant that natural selection shouldn't be possible because there wouldn't be any variation for natural selection to select upon. Well, Mendel, as I say, solved that riddle, and I'll come on to how that happened, but immediately noticed that actually Fleming Jenkins' objection was not an objection specifically to Darwinian natural selection. It was an objection to the known facts, because it was perfectly clear that your grandparents were not more variable than the present generation. It should have been absolutely manifest that there was no variation if Fleming Jenkins was right. So clearly Fleming Jenkins got it wrong because the facts were not as he implied that they should be. Nevertheless, it was taken, and he expressed it as a criticism of Darwinism. The Mendelian solution, which Lobo mentioned yesterday, is a kind of digital genetics. Every gene, Mendel didn't call them genes, but nowadays we call them genes, every gene that is in you came either from your father or your mother. You are not a mixture of your father and your mother. It's more like mixing beads rather than mixing paint. Every gene comes into you from one or other of your parents, and every gene has a 50% chance of leaving you for each one of your parents. And so as the generations go by, you can think of a kind of river of genes going down through the generations. But the river, instead of being made of water, in which substances mix or blend like paint, the river is a river of balls, a river of beads, a river of different colored balls which don't mix with each other. They stay discrete and independent of each other. And that's Mendel's most important finding. Now, it wasn't until about the 1920s or 30s that R.A. Fisher, the great founder of population genetics, realized in full how the Fleming Jenkins riddle was solved by Mendelism. Fisher remarked at the beginning of his book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, that Darwin himself had had faint inklings for something like Mendelian inheritance. Darwin famously never read Mendel, and there are various urban legends to the effect that he had a copy of Mendel's paper in his library, but the pages were uncut. In any case, Darwin's German wasn't that great, and so he might not have got it even if he had cut the pages. But I think it is an urban legend. I'm not sure it's true that Darwin actually had a copy of it. Maybe it is. Anyway, Darwin never knew about Mendel. Mendel knew about Darwin, but not the other way around. But Fisher remarks that Darwin himself had sort of got an inkling of the principle of particulate inheritance. He wrote in a letter to Huxley, "I have lately been inclined to speculate, very crudely and indistinctly, that propagation by true fertilization will turn out to be a sort of mixture and not the true fusion of two distinct individuals, or rather of innumerable individuals, as each parent has its parents and ancestors. I can understand on no other view the way in which crossed forms go back to so large an extent to ancestral forms. But all this, of course, is infinitely crude." That's Fisher. And Fisher expressed mathematically the point that on the blending inheritance model, the variance is approximately halved in each generation. Fisher said, "If variation is to be used by the human breeder or by natural selection, it must be snapped up at once, soon after the mutation has appeared and before it has had time to die away. But because of Mendel's laws, because heredity is particulate, it doesn't die away. It just stays in the population unless there's some positive reason to get rid of it. And that positive reason to get rid of it would normally be natural selection." And Fisher also said, "The mutation rate needed to maintain a given amount of variability is, on the particulate theory," that's Mendel's theory, the mutation rate needed is many thousand times smaller than that which is required on the blending theory. So on the blending theory, as Fleening-Jenkin pointed out, the only way for natural selection to work would be to have a colossal mutation rate to keep the variation up. And this was one of the reasons why, as I said, Darwin, in his later editions, flirted with Lamarckism. But Darwin, as Fisher said, did have some kind of an inkling. And quite recently, a Dr. Seymour J. Gart very kindly sent me a letter by Darwin to Wallace, which suggests to me that Darwin was even closer to independently discovering Mendelism than Fisher realized. This is what he says: "My dear Wallace, I do not think you understand what I mean by the non-blending of certain varieties. It does not refer to fertility. An instance will explain. I crossed the painted," and then the next word is illegible, "and something else, sweet pea, which are very different colored varieties, and got, even out of the same pod, both varieties perfect but non-intermediate." Now there we have the essence of Mendelism. Perfect but non-intermediate. Either one or the other, but not in the middle. Something of this kind, I should think, must occur with your butterflies. He's talking to Wallace here. Now here's a very significant sentence. "Though these cases are in appearance so wonderful, I do not know that they are really more so than every female in the world producing distinct male and female offspring." Now there you have it. If inheritance were really blending, then if you cross a male and a female, and that's what crossing is, you would always get a hermaphrodite. But you either get a male or a female, and that's obviously been known to everybody. So sex inheritance, the inheritance of sex, is quite clearly Mendelian. And yet nobody tumbled to it. It had to wait for Mendel's peas, or actually Darwin, as we've now seen in this letter of 1867 to Wallace. This obvious fact was staring everybody in the face, and all they had to do was to generalize from the fact that male plus female does not equal hermaphrodite to the fact that red plus blue gives either red or blue but not purple. Now, of course, you know that it often does give purple, and we now know that the reason for that is so-called polygenes, where you have not one gene, one blue gene and one red gene making purple, but lots of genes for various colors. And so the effect of taking, say, 20 different genes from the mother and 20 genes from the father, all for color, is to produce what looks like blending. But fundamentally, it's not blending. Now, The modern theory of selection is preeminently a particulate theory. Whereas Darwin had a sort of vague idea of heredity as being like begets like, we now have the Mendelian theory, and natural selection in the modern synthesis, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, consists of changing frequencies of particles. It's really rather a different thing. Changing frequencies, there is a population, there is a gene pool. In that gene pool, you can count the frequency with which every gene occurs. Of course, at any one time, every gene is sitting in the body of an individual, but in the population at large, we have a gene pool, and every gene in the population, in the gene pool, can be said to have a frequency, a number, a percentage frequency. And it's those frequencies that change in evolution. Evolution is change in gene frequencies. Natural selection is biased change in gene frequencies, biased in the direction of improvement. Improvement for survival and reproduction of those very same genes. That's the modern view, but it's surprising that even after Mendel's work was rediscovered, as it was at the turn of the 19th, 20th century by three people independently, even after that, people didn't tumble to the fact that Mendel had solved Darwin's great headache. Instead, the Mendelians, the so-called Mendelians, the rediscoverers of Mendel's work and the people who most promoted Mendelian genetics, they thought that Mendelism was a kind of alternative to Darwinism. That's obvious nonsense, but nevertheless, that's what they thought, and many of them were called Mutationists. One of their leaders was William Bateson, who said, "The transformation of masses of populations by imperceptible steps guided by selection is, as most of us now see, so inapplicable to the fact that we can only marvel at the want of penetration displayed by the advocates of such a proposition." He's talking about Charles Darwin there. There are two of the mutationists. Hugo de Vries was one of the rediscoverers of Mendelism, and T.H. Morgan was one of the greatest geneticists of the 20th century, who worked and had a large school who worked on Drosophila fruit flies. They believed in evolution, but they did not believe that natural selection was an important force guiding evolution. Instead, they thought that mutation alone, random genetic change alone, was enough to account for evolution. That's why they're called mutationists. Well, to the modern mind, this has just got to be nonsense, because mutation being random cannot possibly explain adaptation. It cannot possibly explain why evolution moves in the direction of getting better. It could explain random evolution, but evolution is palpably not random. Eyes are good at seeing, wings are good at flying, legs are good at running, flippers are good at swimming. And if it wasn't for something other than mutation, none of that would be true. Animals would just evolve in random directions. So clearly the mutationists had it wrong. And we had to wait for Fisher and his colleagues, or rather enemies, Haldane and Wright, for the resolution of that. And that's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. But before getting on to that, I should mention that the phrase neo-Darwinism was earlier used around the turn of the 19th century for the importation into the theory of August Weismann's idea of the continuity of the germ plasm. I just want to briefly explain what that was. On the left, you see my image of the river of genes, and I've done it in modern form as a river of DNA codes. But in Weismann's time, nobody knew about DNA, of course, and Weismann used the phrase germ plasm, meaning that which is inherited. And Weismann's big idea was that the germ plasm, what we would now call the genes, was separate from the body, the soma, just Latin for body. So there is a river of genes which flows down the generations. In any one generation, the river is contained in all the bodies in the population, but bodies die, and only the germplasm, the special sequestrated portion of the genes that go into the testes and ovaries, that's the germplasm, and that goes on to future generations. So Weismann had this image of a river. He had the river, and in every generation, the river branched out into a sort of little lake or pond, which was the body. The same genes go sideways into the lake to make a body, and they go longitudinally into the next generation to make the genome of members of the next generation. And the genes that go into the body only make the body, they collaborate in making the body, but they never go into future generations. Only the germplasm goes into future generations. That was Weismann's idea, and it is correct. You have to translate germplasm into genes, otherwise it's correct. Genes do two different things. They make bodies in the process of embryology, and they go into the next generation in the process of genetics. That was the first usage of the phrase neo-Darwinism. And that dropped out and was forgotten until the 1930s, when the phrase neo-Darwinism was again coined to mean the synthesis which was put together by mostly those 6 men and a few others. J.B.S. Haldane on the left, Sewell Wright in the middle of the top, and R.A. Fisher at the top right. Those were the 3 great founders of population genetics. Sewell Wright, you can see, worked on guinea pigs, and you see him holding a guinea pig there. You see the mathematics on the blackboard behind. I don't know how true the rumor is that immediately after that photograph was taken, Sewell Wright picked up the guinea pig, turned round, and erased the mathematics on the blackboard using the guinea pig. At the bottom row, you have George Gaylord Simpson, who was the great paleontologist, the great fossil expert of the neo-Darwinian synthesis. In the middle, there's Ernst Mayr, a great taxonomist and ornithologist who died at the age of 100, I think only 2 years ago. And at the right, Theodosius Dobzhansky, another great geneticist who wrote a big synthetic book. Some classic books of the neo-Darwinian synthesis: R.A. Fisher's Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, J.B.S. Haldane's The Causes of Evolution, G.G. Simpson's Tempo and Mode in Evolution, reprinted as The Major Features of Evolution, Ernst Mayr's Systematics and the Origin of Species, Dobzhansky's Genetics and the Origin of Species, Julian Huxley, there seen on the lap of his grandfather T.H. Huxley, and there is Julian Huxley in maturity. Huxley actually coined the phrase modern synthesis in his book of that title. Ledyard Stebbins, who was the botanist contributor to the modern synthesis, Stebbins also made an interesting point, which I like to make because I think it dispels an important misconception. People sometimes wonder how natural selection, which they assume in some cases must be very weak, could possibly produce the sorts of change that we see. And Stebbins looked at that question theoretically. When people say that an animal does something because it is of advantage to it, how big does that advantage have to be in order for natural selection to, so to speak, see it? Could there be advantages which are so trivial, so slight, that natural selection doesn't notice them? So Stebbins did a calculation. He imagined an extremely weak selection pressure, and he said, suppose you had a population of mouse-sized animals, and you ask the question, how long would it take to evolve, supposing there was selection pressure in favor of increased size, how long would it take to evolve these mouse-sized animals so that they became elephant-sized, which is obviously a pretty dramatic change. Well, he set his selection pressure sufficiently weak that it would be impossible to detect in field work on a place like Galapagos. Some of you may have seen the island of Daphne Major when we were, when we first arrived at Baltra Airport. It was that sort of little island that looked like that, and there was another one the same but smaller off to the right. Daphne Major was the site of Peter and Rosemary Grant's classic work on the Darwin's finches, which is still going on, by the way. And the Grants detected, by measuring populations of Darwin's finches in successive years, the Grants detected colossal selection pressures, huge effects of changes in climate from year to year. Stebbins went to the opposite extreme. Stebbins said, suppose we set our hypothetical selection pressure so weak that in a lifetime of study, people like the Grants, he was writing before the Grants came along, people like the Grants working in the field and measuring animals from year to year couldn't detect it. It would be lost in the random noise of measurement. Nevertheless, there would be a very, very slight selection pressure in favor of increased size. How long would it take to evolve from a mouse-sized animal to an elephant-sized animal? And he calculated that it would be about 12,000 generations. Well, that's far less than 1 million years. It's far less than you could detect in many parts of the fossil record. In other words, there's a mismatch between the amount of evolutionary change that could be detected in the fossil record and the evolutionary change that's going on the ground with field ecologists, people like the Grants, measuring it in the field. If evolution is too slow to be measured in a human lifetime, nevertheless, it can be too fast to be measured in the fossil record. It would or could look like an instantaneous change from mouse size to elephant size, even if the selection pressure is too weak to measure in the field. And if the selection pressure was as strong as the Grants discovered on the island of Daphne Major, then we would go right off the scale as far as rate of evolution on the fossil record is concerned. J.B.S. Haldane, and another of the great founding fathers, did a similar calculation, again taking some apparently negligible selection pressure. The advantage of having hair in your nostrils, for example. Maybe it occasionally stops a bit of dust getting in your nose, and that occasionally stops you sneezing when you would otherwise have sneezed. Well, how could that possibly save your life? Maybe because you sneezed at exactly the moment when a saber-toothed tiger was about to spring, and that delayed you fractionally in getting up a tree, and so you died. That would be a very, very slight selection pressure. Haldane again did a similar calculation with a similar result. A trivial character, he said, let the selection pressure be as small as 1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000, that would mean that for every 1,000 animals that have the hair in their nostrils and survive, 999 animals that don't have the hair in their nostrils survive. So as far as human risk assessment is concerned, as far as the sort of risk assessment that a human life insurance actuary would take seriously, there's no difference between these two animals. One has hair in his nostrils, the other doesn't. Nevertheless, Haldane calculated that if the gene was dominant, it would take only about nearly 12,000 generations to evolve from 1 in 1 million frequency in the population to 1 in 2. And if it was recessive, it would take a bit longer, about 300,000 odd generations. But either way, this would be too short to be detected very often in the fossil record. Once again, we have the same mismatch between the measurement of selection on the ground and measurement of selection in the fossil record. Human judgment, risk assessment, as done by insurance actuaries, is way wrong as far as assessing the sort of risk that matters for natural selection. Could put it this way, that natural selection is a far more pernickety life insurance actuary than a human one. E.B. Ford was another population geneticist, a disciple and pupil of Fisher, who measured selection pressures in the field, mostly using butterflies and moths. And Ford and his colleagues found selection pressures far stronger than anyone had imagined, and far stronger than these hypothetical pressures, which the calculations of Stebbins and Haldane allowed for. The best modern book on natural selection in the wild is by John Endler, and he gathers together the then available evidence in 1986 on natural selection in field work. Endler himself did work on guppies, little fish, in mountain streams in Trinidad and Venezuela. These guppies live in these ponds, these pools, that are separated from lower pools and higher pools by waterfalls. And these fish can't normally move up a waterfall, but they can presumably move down, but they can't move up. But in flood years, the lower pools may become sufficiently high that they can climb up the ladder of pools in some cases. Now, Endler and his colleagues made the observation that in certain places, above a waterfall, there were guppies but no predators, and below a waterfall, there were guppies and predators. And in the place where there were guppies and predators, the guppies were all very drably colored. But in the pool where there were guppies and no predators, the guppies were all bright colored, like peacocks. Like peacocks, because this was sexual selection, the other great theory of Darwinian evolution. They were naturally selected, male guppies were naturally selected by females who liked their bright colors. But in the pools where there were predators, the predators found it easier to find the brightly colored males and so ate them, so there was a counteracting selection pressure against bright colors. This was the observation that Endler made. How could he test it experimentally? How could he test experimentally the theory that it was indeed the predators that were providing the selection pressure that made the difference between the brightly colored guppies where there were no predators and the drably colored guppies where there were predators? Well, he did it both in the lab and in the field. In the lab was a large greenhouse, and he set up a series of 10 artificial ponds in the greenhouse, and he gave gravel bottoms. They all looked exactly the same as each other, except that in some ponds there were predators, and in other ponds there were not. In all the ponds, the guppies were allowed to breed freely. 14 months later, which is 10 guppy generations, the populations in the ponds with no predators were indistinguishable from each other. They were all brightly colored with conspicuous spots, and the populations in the ponds where there were predators were all drab in color. That was an experimental test. What about a field test? Endler took guppies from natural pools below waterfalls, which had predators and were all drab in color, and he transplanted these guppies into a virgin pool above a waterfall where there were no guppies and no predators. So he found a completely empty pool where there were no fish of any kind. He took drab guppies from a pool where there were predators, and he fished the guppies out and put them in the pool where there was nothing, and then just waited to see what would happen. He came back 2 years later and found a definite measurable shift in the guppies towards bright coloration. They hadn't gone all the way yet, but they were definitely brighter. 9 years later still, a colleague called David Resnick revisited Endler's experimental pool and found that they were much more brightly colored. Evolution had taken place before their very eyes in the field over a mere 11 generations. John Endler was...
How many Guppy generations?
About the same, I think slightly more, but it was of the order of the same number of generations. It was 11 years, I think it was, and I forget which way it goes for the generations. John Endler was once riding in a plane in continental United States, and he got talking to his next-door neighbor in the plane, and the next-door neighbor asked him what he did, and Endler told him the story I've just told you, but he never mentioned either the word evolution or natural selection. But he told the story of the experiments and what they showed. And then the man said, "That's really interesting. That's amazing. That's wonderful. There must be some kind of theory underlying all that." And only then did Endler reveal his hand and say, "Yes, it's called Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection." And the man turned away and said, "I don't believe in that." Turned away and terminated the conversation immediately. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're up against. Oh, this is just a further illustration of the experiments I've just told you. There you see the selection in favor of bright coloration is the upper line and drab coloration is the lower line. Now, natural selection, as I said, is, in my view, the only theory which is in principle capable of accounting for adaptation. But it's very much not the only driving force of evolution. And the most important rival to it is the neutral theory associated with the great Japanese geneticist Kimura. Sorry, did somebody ask a question?
That would have been an example of a change in frequencies, but not necessarily a mutation necessary to cause the variation.
Okay, did you all hear the question? What's going on here is that natural selection doesn't sit around waiting for mutations to happen. Mutations are all the time feeding into the pool of variation, which is constantly being reshuffled in the gene pool by sexual reproduction. The gene pool is really quite a good image. Think of it as a pool of balls in which are being stirred around. And mutation is a kind of feed of new balls, new beads into the pool. But it's sex that provides the variation. So probably most of the variation needed is kind of already there in the population, but distributed around. And then it redistributes itself by sexual reproduction. And natural selection favors those individuals who, in this redistribution, are a bit more brightly colored than the others. And there's all the time new mutation feeding in at the same time. Right, the neutral theory is associated with Motu Kimura, the great Japanese population geneticist. It's very important to understand that the neutral theory does not explain adaptation, and its proponents such as Kimura don't even claim that it does. They are molecular geneticists, and to them evolution is change in gene frequencies as measured by geneticists looking at the molecules, at the molecular sequences of genes. Many mutations are neutral. Neutral means not that they're useless, but that they are equivalent to the other mutation to the other gene before it mutated. So you have a gene, A, which mutates to A dash. A and A dash are definitely different genes. It's a definite mutation in the molecular sense, but A and A dash are exactly the same as each other in terms of the effect that they have on the body. In some cases, they're literally synonymous. Those of you who know about the genetic code may know that that triplet codons, triplets of DNA bases, code for particular amino acids, which are the sort of business part of embryology. And the code is degenerate. Technically, it's called degenerate, which means that any one amino acid may be coded for by more than one triplet codon. Any one amino acid has more than one genetic codon, as it were, converging on it in the map of the genetic code. So if a mutation occurs between a codon and a new codon, which gives rise to exactly the same amino acid, then the protein that's formed will be identical. This is literally a synonymous mutation. So that the effect on the body, on the wing shape, on the eye color, whatever it might be, is literally zero. It doesn't mean that the gene has zero effect, far from it. It means that the mutation has zero effect compared with the previous version of the gene before the mutation happened. Kimura believed, and he's probably right, that the majority of evolutionary change as measured genetically, as measured in changes of genes at the molecular level, the majority of evolutionary change is neutral. Most evolution is neutral if you're a molecular geneticist. But of course, if you're a field biologist out in Galapagos, you're not really interested in the fact you're not very interested in the fact that the genes themselves may be changing. What you care about is, have the wings become a little bit darker? Have the eyes become a little bit bigger? Have the feet become a little bit bluer? Those are the only changes that matter to the field naturalist. And according to Kimura, those changes are the tip of the iceberg, speaking genetically. But it's the tip of the iceberg which is the only thing that matters as far as natural selection is concerned, and it's the only thing that matters as far as we who are field naturalists are concerned. So the question of whether there are neutral genetic changes the answer is yes, most definitely, if you're thinking of it at the level of molecular genetics. But if you're thinking of it at the level of the things that you actually see, the so-called phenotypes, then it is at least arguable that any phenotypic change will never be neutral, selectively neutral. I said it's arguable. I'm not saying that's so, but it has been argued quite forcibly.
When you just talked about the phenotypic changes being neutral or non-neutral, one of the major things we do when we refute intelligent design, of course, is to discuss the redundant gene. The one that acts as a Xerox copy of another, so that it can continue doing. Is there some interconnection between what you just said and the function of the redundant gene?
That's an excellent point. Genes that once did something and no longer do are very common, and you can recognize them because the sequence, the DNA sequence, is either exactly the same or nearly the same. It's a bit like a hard disk on a computer, which when you look at the directory, the file list on your hard disk, it's all nice and neat and you know what everything is and it's all got a name and things. But what you don't know is that your hard disk is littered with extra copies of your files which have been deleted or been temporarily used for storage space or something of that sort. And you can tell by looking at the sequence that they're the same as the chapter you were writing 6 months ago. But you never actually see that. Genes are just like that. There are genes which are recognizably the same as useful genes, but are no longer read. The reading machinery just never even looks at them. And this is powerful evidence against intelligent design. It's a separate point. It's not really relevant, I think, to the neutral theory, but it's a very important separate point. There are other genetic sequences which are not vestigial remnants of earlier genes that once did something useful. There are others which are just sort of nonsense repeats that say things like AT, which doesn't mean anything at all, but they're called tandem repeats, and they are very useful for geneticists in other respects. The genome is littered, cluttered with rubbish. once again, we have a tip of the iceberg phenomenon. It's a different tip of the iceberg phenomenon. The genes that are actually used, that are actually read, that actually get turned into phenotypes, into things that you can see and touch, is again a tip of the iceberg. That's 50 minutes. I think, let me just have a look and see. I'm trying to decide whether to stop at this point. Have people got lots of questions they'd like to ask? Because in that case, I think I'll stop now, and because I've got another lecture coming. I think it's tomorrow. Yes?
Keep going.
Okay. Well, let me just have this question.
How many generations would it have taken for those guppies to no longer be able to interbreed and be different species?
That's a very nice question. How long would it take for them no longer to be able to interbreed? I don't know the answer in the particular case of guppies, but again, it would be probably very fast by the standards of what you can tell in the fossil record. The way that happens is the way that incipient new species which become isolated in different places, in this case in different pools in a stream. In order for those to become separate species, it would be necessary that they were kept apart for sufficiently long that their genomes were so different that they could no longer work together to produce offspring. That would be the first thing that would happen. Galapagos is a beautiful example of this. We're not talking now about pools in a stream. We're talking about islands initially separated from the mainland and separated from each other. The isolation, the geographical isolation, is such that evolution takes place separately on the different islands, and when it takes place separately for sufficient number of generations, the incipient species, the races, the subspecies, the populations, move apart sufficiently far that they can no longer interbreed. And the reason that happens first, I mean, eventually they become so far apart they don't even want to interbreed. But in the intermediate stage, when they still quite like to mate with each other, it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that the chromosomes from the two parents, you know that every one of you, every one of us, has 23 chromosomes from our father and 23 chromosomes from our mother. And these chromosomes are floating around in our cells independently. They don't join up. Chromosome 7 doesn't join up, of the father, doesn't join up with chromosome 7 of the mother. They both independently exert their effects on the body. But they do join up at one crucial time, which is in meiosis, the process of producing a new sex cell, a sperm or an egg. When that happens, chromosome 7 finds it from the father, finds its opposite number, chromosome 7 from the mother, and they line up and cross over and exchange genetic material all the way along. They exchange genetic material so that the new chromosome 7 that is produced is neither the paternal chromosome 7 nor the maternal chromosome 7, but a mixture of the two. Now, that can only happen if the two chromosome 7s recognize each other. And one of the first things that happens when two incipient species have drifted sufficiently far apart on different islands or different pools in a stream, when they've diverged sufficiently far apart, their pairs of chromosomes, their chromosome 7, their chromosome 11, etc., cannot recognize each other and therefore cannot cross over and cannot produce sex cells. And which is why the first thing that happens when lions cross with tigers or donkeys cross with horses is you get offspring which are perfectly healthy animals, but they can't breed. They can't breed because they can't produce viable sperms or eggs. And how long that takes, I don't know, but it would be probably the same order as it takes to produce a fairly major, longer than it took to produce those brightly colored guppies, but maybe thousands of generations rather than just tens of generations. Yes, sorry, Christine.
Okay, this molecular geneticist who came up with the neutral theory,
Is he saying that one amino acid that's coded by one codon gives a different phenotypic effect than the same amino acid by a different codon?
No.
Or is he saying that there's no change in frequency?
There's no change in the amino acid itself. An identical amino acid is produced, and so the consequence of that is that the phenotypic effect is identical as well. That would be the extreme. Another version of it would be that the amino acid might change, but the protein itself doesn't change. What happens is that proteins are important in embryology mostly because they are enzymes. Enzymes are important because they catalyze, speed up particular chemical reactions. Particular chemical reactions speed up, and that affects cellular processes, which affects things like the rate at which membranes develop and things. So the crucial change is to a protein insofar as it has an enzyme effect. And the enzymic effect, the enzymatic effect of a protein depends upon its 3D structure, its solid structure. A protein is a one-dimensional sequence of amino acids, a string, a necklace of amino acids. And the sequence of amino acids in the protein chain causes the protein chain to coil up in a complicated way, a knot. That's according to the laws of chemistry. The laws of chemistry dictate that the one-dimensional sequence of amino acids make it coil up into one of a small set of three-dimensional structures. And it's the three-dimensional structure that gives it its enzymatic qualities, literally its solid structure. It literally forms a sort of template for the chemicals that it's going to catalyze the reaction between to fit into. So if you make a change in the one-dimensional sequence of amino acids, that may or may not affect the three-dimensional knot in which it ties itself. And if it doesn't affect that, then once again we're going to have the same phenotypic effect. It'll only affect the phenotypic effect if it causes a change in the solid shape, the three-dimensional shape of this knot, which is caused by the amino acids interacting with each other chemically.
Richard, back to natural selection. Does it occur at the level of the individual or the species or the population, as lately evidence that the prevalence of homosexuality is very great?
Does natural selection occur at the level of the individual, the species, or the population? Well, in my view, neither. In my view, the answer to your question is it occurs at the level of the gene. And I illustrate that in this way. If you ask the question, what is this good for? What is something good for? You could say a penis is to help an organism to reproduce. So is a mammary gland. So is a peacock's tail. They're all to do with reproduction. Penis, obviously, mammary gland feeds the young. Peacock's tail attracts a peahen. An estrogen molecule, it's a hormone that causes females to develop in the right way. So is a DNA molecule. Wrong. That's the odd one out of the list. You might think that a DNA molecule is part of the apparatus by which an individual produces a new individual. And in one sense that's got to be true, but it's deeply misleading as far as Darwinian selection is concerned. And that's the answer to your question. To put it in another way, there's your list of things that could be, you could say natural selection could work at the level of the individual, the group, the ecosystem, even the entire world. Does natural selection work for the good of the group? Does it work for the good of the species? Does it work for the good of the ecosystem? Or the gene? The gene doesn't belong in that list. The gene is out there on its own, and the reason is that a gene, unlike an individual or anything else there, is a replicator. A replicator is something that either survives or it doesn't survive. Who's feedbacking? Is it me or is it somebody else? Perhaps we could switch off the roving mic. It. A replicator is something that survives or fails to survive. Natural selection is the differential survival of good entities at the expense of bad entities. And the question we're now asking is, do individuals, groups, species, etc., count as entities which either survive or don't survive? And the reason they don't, the reason why only genes do, is that when genes survive or fail to survive, the frequency of particular genes changes in important directions. A good gene is one that has a high frequency in the population. It earns itself a high frequency in the population by the effects that it has mostly on individual bodies. But an individual doesn't have a frequency in the population. An individual is just itself, there's just one of it. You can't talk about the frequency of a particular individual, but you can talk about the frequency of a gene. You can talk about the frequency of a gene for a particular kind of hemoglobin, a gene for a particular sort of eye color. And so since the whole point about neo-Darwinism is that it is changes in frequencies of something, you've got to look for a something which can be said to have a frequency at all. And that's exactly what genes have. They have a frequency. Some are frequent, some are infrequent, some increase in frequency, some decrease in frequency. The individual bodies are vehicles in which they sit, which don't have a frequency. What they have is phenotypic effects by which we can measure the frequency of the underlying genes. You can express natural selection in two different ways. You can say that when you're talking about the gene, unit in the sense of replicator, then it's the gene that's the unit of selection, and what it maximizes is survival. Whereas you could, if you wish to, re-describe the whole effect at the level of the individual organism, in which case the organism is the vehicle in this particular model. But what it maximizes is not its own survival, but its own fitness, its own Darwinian fitness. Nowadays it's called inclusive fitness, which is its capacity to replicate the genes inside it, or copies of the genes inside it. So if you want to answer your question by saying it's the individual that's the unit of selection, then you have to do some fairly sophisticated mathematics to work out what it is that it's maximizing. It's not its own survival, because that's got to include reproduction, it's got to include also the reproduction of other close relatives. What it's maximizing is the survival of its genes. And so, and we call that inclusive fitness. So you might as well cut out the whole level of explanation involving the organism and inclusive fitness and go straight to the gene, which is the true replicator, and what's being maximized is survival. That is all the theory of my late great colleague, W.D. Hamilton, whom I miss sorely. There he is on the Amazon. And I think shall we stop there? Or I'm happy to answer more questions if there are. Right at the back, yes.
You said earlier that mutations can increase the gene pool of a species, but what else does that?
Well, mutations increase the amount of genetic variety in the gene pool. They feed in new variety into the gene pool.
But what else can do that?
What else can feed in new genes into the gene pool? Well, migration, immigration from another area. So a new blood, one often calls it. New blood flies in from the mainland, or gets blown in from the mainland, or drifts in from the mainland on a mangrove raft. That's how the Galapagos Islands got colonized in the first place. And that's how genes flow from island to island. Genes flow from island to island sufficiently seldom that there's time for evolutionary change to happen on the island in between immigration events. And that's important. That's why island archipelagos like Galapagos are workshops of evolution. They're workshops of evolution only for those animals that have a capacity to move from island to island that means that these things really are islands. To a fast-flying, long-distance bird, the Galapagos archipelago might as well be a continent because it can fly so quickly from one to another, and so easily from one to another, that gene flow is constant. There's constant immigration of new genes from every island to every other island all the time. But to an animal like, a woodlouse, which can't fly, these islands really are islands, and the only way they can travel from one to another would be by extremely rare accidents, like drifting mangrove roots or something of that sort. So immigration is important. It's extremely important for explaining the fauna of a place like Galapagos. It's the other main way in which new genetic variation can enter the gene pool. Sexual reproduction is the way in which existing variation gets reshuffled and redistributed through the gene pool.
Back to Endler and the dull and the bright guppies.
Still shout.
Yes. You said something very interesting, and that is that when he brought it into the lab, it took 14 months to produce the result, whereas when he took it into the field, it took 9 years to begin to see something similar. Is this differential?
Yes, I don't know what the reason for that was. I suppose maybe the predation pressure was stronger in the lab. Maybe, after all, in these ponds where there were predators and guppies, maybe it was very easy for the predators to maybe the sheer number of deaths of guppies through predation was higher. But I don't know enough about the details. There probably is a better answer than that.
When you talked about the comparison between 12,000 generations and yet in geologic time, that's a very short period of time. Is that what gives rise to this, some people thinking in terms of punctuated equilibrium, where they see this rapid...
Yes. I don't know whether you got that. I think you have to stuff the microphone almost right down your throat.
The comparison between...
Yeah, I got it. Did anybody else get it?
Yeah.
The question was about, in those calculations by Stebbins and Haldane that I told you about, where even very slight selection pressures could give rise to evolutionary change so rapid that it would be indistinguishable from instantaneous on the fossil record. He says, is that one of the things that gives rise to the impression of punctuated equilibrium? And for those of you who know what punctuated equilibrium is, the answer is yes. That's exactly the kind of thing that could give rise to punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is the model of fossil change put forward by Eldridge and Gould to account for the fact that very often there are interruptions in the fossil record. Interruptions in the fossil record, so-called gaps in the fossil record, are of course meat and drink to creationists. And one of the replies to creationists would be exactly as you've said, that sometimes evolution goes so rapidly that it doesn't show on the fossil record. In particular, when it happens in another place, as it so often does in a place like when you have islands offshore off a continent. If you're digging for fossils in the continent, you may see a sudden discontinuity in an otherwise continuous evolutionary change. And that sudden discontinuity could be because the population went offshore to an island or an archipelago, evolved there, and then one got blown back again. By now it had evolved to a different form. And so it looks like an instantaneous change. And that's the mode of evolutionary change that Eldridge and Gould themselves most emphasized.
So it seems that the important unit for genetics is the amount of genes in the gene pool. At what point could the population, say about 10 million people down to a dozen people, you actually start to really diminish the diversity in that gene pool? And is that going to be something that conservationists are going to worry about, not just the amount of the number of individuals of species, but also the diversity in the gene pool?
Yes.
Investigation purposes?
Yes, I can't give exact figures, but there does come a point when the population becomes so small that there's insufficient diversity, and then the population then does become extremely vulnerable. I said that natural selection doesn't work at the level of species, but here's a case where it almost sounds as though it is, that a species which has dropped down to such a small population that there's very little variation, such a species is likely to go extinct. Differential extinction of species can be thought of as a kind of natural selection. The only way in which I would dissent from calling it natural selection is that it doesn't give rise to evolutionary change. But there is a sense in which there's a sort of minimal population size for the species to stay in existence. Cheetahs went through a bottleneck which probably almost wiped them out within the last 100,000 years or so. And there's possibly some evidence that humans did as well, because the variation among humans is surprisingly little. The genetic variation among all humans on Earth is surprisingly low, surprisingly little variation compared to, say, chimpanzees.
I would like to take the floor for a second here. Most of us, with Emily here, we've got something. Emily and I, we all realized that we came on this trip. Most of us had always longed to come to the Galapagos, but the reason we're particularly on this trip is because of the group of people we have here, and in particular because of Richard, whose particular combination of gene pool and nurturing resulted in the man that we love his writings. And you're all sitting there with your books to get signed, but before that we have a little something here that we want to do. It occurred to me when I saw that Emily was a fan of Gilbert and Sullivan that we could do a little something together here. So this was put together by the two of us, and we have rehearsed it almost non-existently. So,
Of course, we have no key.
we're going to pick my key because my voice can reach the back of the room without the microphone. So let's see. But so he is
an Englishman.
for he himself has said it, and it's greatly to his credit that he is an Englishman. That he is an Englishman. And he might have been a Buddhist, Hindu, Jew, Muslim, Voodooist, or perhaps a Christian. God forbid a Christian. Though exposed to all religion, he's no sheep or Skinner pigeon.
He remains
a humanist. A secular humanist. Sorry about the change of speech.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope you got that, Josh. That'll be preserved for posterity. Thank you very much indeed. If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.